Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. For our opening prayer tonight, we'll be using Psalm 4, which is the psalm that Augustine uses in Book 9 that we'll take a look at in just a minute. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. I called, the God of justice gave me answer. From anguish you released me. Have mercy and hear me. Children of man, how long will my glory be dishonored? Will you love what is futile and seek what is false? Know that the Lord works wonders for his faithful one. The Lord will hear me whenever I call him. Tremble, do not sin. Ponder on your bed and be still. Offer right sacrifice and trust in the Lord. What can bring us happiness, many say. Lift up the light of your face on us, O Lord. You have put into my heart a greater joy than abundance of grain and new wine can provide. In peace, I will lie down and fall asleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so for tonight's lecture, we have two very different books 9 and 10. Book 9 wraps up the narrative story of Augustine's conversion. We ended last week with the famous conversion in the garden scene. He and Alypius go to meet his mother Monica at the very end, and Monica's 20 years of tears are finally put to an end, as she had been expecting all along. Monica had absolute faith in what she had taken as God's promise to her, that she would live to see Augustine converted. So then in Book 9, we're going to have the end of Augustine's stay in Milan, the intended plan to go back home to Africa, and basically to set up what's more or less an ascetic, quasi-monastic community. And then in Book 10, things change. If any of you struggled with Book 10, if any of you gave it about 5 minutes and then just closed the book and said, I'll try this later, I certainly can't judge you on that one. Book 10 is extremely difficult, and it's hard to figure out exactly what Augustine is doing. It does make sense. It's just very hard. And as I said in the email that I sent out, we'll take a look at the spot where he sends news to St. Ambrose that he's ready to be converted. He wants to be baptized. And St. Ambrose suggests that he read the prophet Isaiah. And Augustine tries reading Isaiah and finds the first few chapters just incomprehensible. And so he just puts it off until later. So if Augustine, with the full education that he has, isn't ready for Isaiah on the first read, anybody who struggles with the last 4 books of Confessions can certainly be excused for that. What he's doing does make sense, and whether it makes sense and you actually want to read it are two very different things, however. Every time that I read Confessions, there's always something that I'd kind of forgotten about in books 1 through 9, or that strike me in a different way. But 10 through 13, the experience of reading those is just completely different over the years. Probably if I were to read it again just a few months from now, the experience would be very different. It's very reflective, it's very meditative. It can be very dull if you're not in the right headspace for understanding what it is, or for not appreciating what it is that Augustine's trying to do. So we'll have the usual schedule that we have. I'll divide the 2 books up basically into 4 sections, dealing with Book 9 first, and then we'll do the best that we can to get through Book 10. So the first half of Book 9 covers his immediate response to his conversion the baptism, and then we'll end the first part of this with some comments on Saint Ambrose and what's going on in the church in Milan while Ambrose is there. And then the second part of Confessions is devoted almost entirely to his mother. So book 9, opening. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant and your handmaid son. You burst my bonds asunder, and to you will I offer a sacrifice of praise. May my heart and tongue give praise to you, and all my bones cry out their question, who is like you, O Lord? Yes, let them ask, then do you respond and say to my soul, I am your salvation. What Augustine has in this book is a celebration of liberation. And of course, for Augustine, it's going to be expressed paradoxically in the terms of servitude. O Lord, I am your servant. But the paradox of creation is that man only is truly free when man accepts his proper relation to the Creator, that we acknowledge ourselves as creatures, and that our essential purpose is to love God. And in recognizing that and turning to God in love and service, that is the only place that actual freedom can be found. And that's what Augustine is celebrating in this book. And one of the things as we go through book 9 that we should be sort of aware of and looking for is how much book 9, in a sense, incorporates elements that we saw previously in books 1 through 7. That we have similar episodes that have a different turn on them now because Augustine has the liberation of having accepted Christ. He has the liberation of salvation to look forward to. And so what had been moments of tragedy, of confusion, of despair in book 1 through 7, similar episodes in book 9 will be presented through the lens of one who has accepted Christ. And so here, still in section 1 here, Augustine's going through who am I, what am I? And he goes through his past history, but those questions about who am I and what am I, not only do we only have actual freedom in acknowledging our subservience to God, but we only have our real identity in acknowledging that. The fragmentation, the divided self that has been the hallmark of books 1 through 7 and book 8 up until he hears the voice and is converted. It is only through our relationship with God that we can come to know ourselves. And later on, we'll have the explicit line that even our true self is fully known only to God. Even we don't have full knowledge of ourselves. That is the full knowledge that God has that we do not have as creatures, includes full knowledge of ourselves. And that's something to look forward to as we go ahead. And then just these lines that I had highlighted here. How sweet did it suddenly seem to me to shrug off those sweet frivolities, and how glad I now was to get rid of them. I who had been loath to let them go. Everything, those little addictions that Augustine had, particularly his addiction to lust, that now that he lets go of them, this fear that he had, I mean, a very real fear that goes through the inner dialogue towards the end of book 8, and how sweet it suddenly seems to shrug these off now, these sweet frivolities. For it was you who cast them out for me, you, our real and all surpassing sweetness. You cast them out and entered yourself to take their place. You who are lovelier than any pleasure, though not to flesh and blood, more lustrous than any light, yet more inward than is any secret intimacy, loftier than all honor, yet not to those who look for loftiness in themselves. My mind was free at last from the gnawing need to seek advancement and riches, to welter in filth and scratch my itching lust. So this true freedom that Augustine has now, and this sense that it was not I who chose you, but you who chose I. and that's going to be a hallmark of these two books as well, is Augustine acknowledging what grace actually is, that it is God acting on his life, and it's not as though he's completely passive. He chose to respond to this call of grace. And I talked last time about the Pelagians, Pelagius and the doctrine that they were teaching. And what Pelagius held is sort of this Stoic vision of the human will, that the properly directed mind, the properly ascetic person is able to direct their will and do whatever they want. And what you have here, and this is written before Augustine confronts the Pelagians. Confessions is written probably 397 to 399. But the idea of grace, that it is God's action and that all we have to do is simply accept God's love. God will work these things out if we allow him to. That is in Augustine's thought very firmly before he confronts the Pelagians, whose, their doctrine of the supremacy of the will and, the great Olympic free will that can conquer everything. Augustine rejects that later on because he sees in his own life that he had wasted so much of his time in trying to have his will surmount all of these obstacles. And when he finally allowed God to work in his life, then how sweet did it all suddenly seem. So as Augustine's taking stock of things, the first thing he does now is renounces his career. He had been the professor of rhetoric. He was teaching young men basically how to argue cases in courts of law, how to present arguments for a life of politics. And very quickly that turns into teaching people how to lie for personal advancement. And we've seen all throughout Confessions that this has bothered him. And finally, having something better now. He has Christ. He lets this go. But here in sections 2 and 3, we come up with something interesting, which Augustine doesn't immediately renounce his career. There is a holiday, basically, a vacation time coming up in the empire that runs late in the summer, in the early fall. And what Augustine believes is that if before this vacation takes place, if he stands up and announces his conversion to Christianity at that point in time, he's concerned that people would see him as boasting, basically, that he was making a show of himself, that he was putting his conversion out on display. I thought it better to retire unobtrusively rather than to make an abrupt and sensational break. One of the things we've noticed about Augustine, he is so concerned not so much about the opinions of other people in and of themselves, but he is deeply concerned that other people not attribute the wrong motives to his actions. He is extremely sensitive towards people attributing some kind of a secretive, manipulative motive to what he's doing. And certainly there were some of those who believed that about him. That he'd been trained in rhetoric, and then all of a sudden, just a few years after Christianity is made the sole religion of the empire, then he has his conversion. There certainly would have been people who thought that he was being opportunistic. So it's not just Augustine being hypersensitive by nature, although that certainly seems to be his nature. His own experience would have shown him that there were plenty of people willing to attribute bad motives to him. So he's always concerned about how can I do this in a way that best reflects my true humility in this matter. Augustine is absolutely obsessive in thinking how he can act in a way that everybody will see the sincerity that he actually has. So he decides to continue teaching up until this vacation hits. And apparently in the Roman Empire, just like Italy today, if any of you have made the mistake of traveling to Italy in the middle of August and the entire country shuts down, the entire country basically goes on a 2-week vacation at the Feast of the Assumption. In Augustine's day, something similar would have happened, although it predates Christian holidays, as far as we can tell. So he waits for that time to pass, and then while he's on when they come back from vacation, then he subtly sort of puts in his resignation, for the purpose of trying to keep the attention off of himself, to not make this sensationalistic, and probably to try to limit the number of people who saw him being opportunistic in his conversion. So he, Alypius, his mother, Nebridius, that the core group that's around him, they take this opportunity to spend time together just in each other's company, to sort of their own little retreat at Cassicacum, which is this land that's owned by Verecundus. Verecundus was mentioned earlier just in passing, but he's the one that owns the property that he's letting them stay on. And what we start to see here in section 5 is a replaying of some of those events that had happened to him earlier in life. So we'll start with Verecundus, and while Alypius and Nebridius and Augustine are extremely happy in this moment, Nebridius has not converted yet, Alypius has. Verecundus loves Augustine very much. I mean, he's letting him stay for free at his place, which is apparently a very expensive place based on the descriptions that we have of it. But because Verecundus is married, there's no chance for Verecundus to be able to share in this life that Augustine is building, this sort of quasi-ascetic monastic group. So Verecundus was racked with anxiety over this good thing that had befallen us, because he saw himself being distracted from our fellowship by the bonds that unbreakably held him. He was not yet a Christian, and though his wife was a believer, it was precisely she who trammeled him most rigidly and restrained him from the path on which we had set out. For he declared that he was unwilling to be a Christian in any other way than that from which he was debarred. So remember the role of the life of Saint Anthony that Augustine had heard about, that Pontitianus, who was one of the conversion stories in Book 8, had told Augustine about. The joy of this ascetic life of prayer and solitude. Since Verecundus is married, that's not an opportunity for him. And so we have, again, one of these moments of the people that knew Augustine loved him very much. And Verecundus is kind of heartbroken that Augustine is going on this fantastic spiritual development that he, Verecundus, can't go on because of his state of marriage. And we go on, and Augustine mentions that Verecundus dies. That after Augustine and his group goes on to Rome, Verecundus falls ill. Before he dies, he has himself baptized as a Christian. So he dies in a state of grace, which Augustine is extremely happy for. And what we have to think of now is that scene in Book 4 where Augustine's friend dies. When Augustine is the Manichae, his friend dies, and Augustine literally does not know how he can go on. He has this amorphous sense of grief that just overcomes everything in his life. Now that his friend Verecundus dies, his friend dies in Christ. And there's no sense. The grief that Augustine feels for him is appropriate now. He recognizes that Verecundus is going on to an eternal reward, and Augustine delights in that for him. He's lost a friend, but Augustine's life isn't destroyed because he didn't make the mistake of turning Verecundus into something that he's not. He's acknowledged Verecundus as a creation, just like himself. And so when Verecundus dies, there's something tragic about for Augustine, but there's the happiness of knowing that he died reconciled to Christ. And then we bring up his other friend, Nebridius. Nebridius was introduced when Augustine was talking of Alypius. When we had a long discussion about Alypius and Augustine's love of Alypius, Alypius's sin, loving the circuses, and then getting drawn into the gladiatorial bouts. Nebridius is brought up in that same passage, but he's not talked about very much. So here he's talked about. And he also mentions that Nebridius had a very common heretical belief about Christ, that while Nebridius was not a Christian, he believed in, well, not yet a Christian, he, like us, had fallen into a pit of very dangerous error, believing that the flesh of your son, who is the truth, was mere make-believe. So the Manichees believed that Jesus Christ was divine, but they believed that the word was divine. They did not believe that Jesus Christ was real flesh and blood. They believed that it was just an appearance. This is what's known as Docetism. The idea that Christ's body was simply apparent, a phantasm is how Augustine describes it earlier. So here we mentioned that Nebridius had this viewpoint as well. And then after Augustine and Alypius's conversion and rebirth, Nebridius eventually has himself baptized. And then Nebridius goes back to Africa where he'd come up with them. And then he dies. And Augustine just mentions that the way that it flows. He was serving you in chastity and continence in Africa when his whole household had become Christian through his example, and you released him from the flesh. And that's the notice that we have of his death. And now he lives in Abraham's bosom. Whatever that may be, whatever the gospel word bosom may be, there my Nebridius is living, to me a friend most tenderly loved, to you, Lord, a freedman adopted as your son. Yes, there he lives. And so, again, we have a loss that isn't tragic, because it's a loss that's only temporary, that Nebridius goes on to the bosom of Abraham. And we have for Augustine, one of these odd moments of humility where, he's talking about that phrase out of the gospel, the bosom of Abraham. Whatever that may be, whatever this word may actually mean, I don't know, Augustine says, but I know that Nebridius is there. A freedman adopted as your son. Where else could such a soul be at home? He is alive in that place about which he used to ask so many questions. Ignorant and paltry fellow that I am. No longer does he bend his ear to my mouth. Rather does he lay the mouth of his spirit to your fountain and avidly slake his thirst as he drinks your wisdom to the uttermost of his capacity in happiness without end. So Nebridius, who once had been addressing all of these questions to Augustine and waiting for Augustine's answer, through the death of the body, Nebridius is now literally in the better place, the place that Augustine can't even accurately describe, and no longer having to wait for Augustine's answers on things. Nebridius drinks wisdom, that Nebridius has the vision of God and has that wisdom that Augustine has been searching for since he read Cicero at 19. So these are the first couple of examples that are bringing back similar episodes to what happened in his life, but through Christ, what had been tragic no longer is. And so then we have the section here where Augustine, Alypius, Adeodatus, his son, Nebridius, briefly, and then possibly some others go to Cassachacum, and they live this life together during this holiday. And later on, Augustine describes that Monica was acting basically as a mother to the entire group. And so they spend this time in prayerful reflection. We have to imagine almost nonstop discussion, but also writing. Augustine writes in this period, and if you read some of the things he writes, like the soliloquies, you can see that he's still shaking off the tendencies of Roman rhetoric. And Alypius here, he mentions that Alypius, although he's committed to becoming Christian, in his writing style, he can't break through that. He's still writing in this sort of philosophical mode. At first, he disdained to admit the name of Jesus Christ into his writings, for he wanted them to give off the tang of those lofty cedars of Lebanon. The stand-in for philosophy here, the lofty cedars, felled though these were now by the Lord, rather than the scent of plants grown in your church and efficacious against snake bites. And now we have, this question came up earlier, and this section here is why I suggested the essay that's in the back of your book on page 491. About the confessions as prayer and the role of the Psalms. During the first lesson, somebody had asked about the Psalms and how they're appearing all throughout this. The Psalms are the language of confession. The Psalms are the language that Augustine is searching for. He's trained in rhetoric, which means what's automatic for him is finding the idea that there's a right way of describing things. There are right words, there are right expressions, that how you describe something must correspond to what that is and what you're trying to say about that. And I mean, you could see earlier that he talked about his struggles with this, and it's in the book of Psalms that he finds the language to speak to God. And that's why all of those footnotes are throughout your book, referring to which psalm he's quoting from, but he quotes from it as though they're his own words, because in a sense they have become his own words. Augustine loves the Psalms, writes more about the Psalms, I think, than any other church father. His exposition on the Psalms is, I think, 3 times as long as the work City of God. It's something that he worked on for at least 20 years. And so now he has the chance to take these Psalms and to find the words that he's been searching for to describe God for 20 years. And we began in prayer with Psalm 4, the psalm that he goes through here almost line by line. And he goes back to this disdain that he has for the Manichees. I felt bitterly angry with the Manichees because he remembers the Manichees ruining for him any idea that truth could be found in the scriptures. But his indignation was tinged with pity because they knew nothing of this remedy and ranted against the very antidote which might have healed them. I wish that they had been somewhere nearby without my knowing it and had gazed upon my face and listened to my voice as I read the 4th Psalm in that place of peace. So the anger that he feels at the Manichees is that perfect anger. He's not angry with them as people. He's angry with what they've done. He's angry with the time that he's lost because of this. But he's not so angry as to wish to see them damned. He wished that he were in a place of converting them as well. Then we'll move on to the final bit for this first section, which is Ambrose. And here in 13 is where he writes to Ambrose, explains exactly what his intentions are. Ambrose is very happy, and he recommends Isaiah. The first part I read of that gospel was incomprehensible to me. The first part I read of this book was incomprehensible to me, however, and assuming that all the rest would be the same, I put it off, meaning to take it up again later when I was more proficient in the word of the Lord. And this, of course, is exactly what happens. He picks up Isaiah again. He's never going to let that. Augustine's not the kind of person that can possibly just put something off for the rest of his life. But he recognizes that he's just not in a place for those words to have meaning to him. And later on, when he's more fully immersed in scriptures, then he takes them. Adeodatus, his son, is mentioned here, and we'll just include this in passing, that he talks about Adeodatus. He loves his son very much. He talks about how gifted he was, and then he also lets us know that Adeodatus dies young. Very soon you took him away from this life on earth. But I remember him without anxiety, for I have no fear about anything in his boyhood or adolescence. Indeed, I fear nothing whatever for that man. We included him in the group as our contemporary in the life of your grace, to be schooled along with us in your doctrine. And it might sound cold, but it's not at all. the whole point that Augustine has been getting at in all of this is that you have to love God first. To love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, and to love everybody else as a creature. And for him to love Adeodatus as his son more than he loved Adeodatus as a child of God would be to put Adeodatus in the wrong category. And so Augustine can be confident that Adeodatus is with God and not be destroyed at the loss of him. And then this last bit, getting back, because he goes from Ambrose to Adeodatus back to Ambrose. The question of hymns and canticles, that Augustine absolutely loves the use of song in the church. I think we've all heard that line of Augustine, that he who sings praise twice. What he's talking about here in 15 is when Ambrose is made bishop, Milan is torn apart between Arianism and Catholicism. Justina, the mother of Valentinian, who is a boy emperor, so he's being controlled by his mother at this point in time. She is trying to have things given over to the Arian church, and she demands that Ambrose hand over the basilica. And Ambrose refuses to do this. Soldiers are called out, and Ambrose and his congregation stay in the church. Ambrose is willing to put himself up to martyrdom. And it doesn't happen, but we certainly, even though the emperor is Christian, you can't rule out an emperor killing anybody simply out of anger because their person, that of the emperor, they feel it's disrespected. And there is a real chance that Ambrose could have been martyred in this, and Ambrose was ready for this. And what Augustine includes in this is the use that Ambrose made of song. And he's going to quote one of Ambrose's songs later on, Deus Creator Omnia. And Ambrose, in order to defeat Arianism, writes these beautiful hymns that are still part of the Liturgy of the Hours. And it's Ambrose that makes systematic use of the doxology in the final stanza of all of his hymns, that there is Trinitarian Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in as many different ways as he can in his verse. And Ambrose was an incredible poet on top of that. And people would leave the church and they would be singing these hymns. They'd be singing the hymns all day long. And by singing the hymns, they would be promoting Trinitarian theology against the Arian theology, which held that Jesus Christ was not fully God. And then Ambrose also introduced the form of singing where one side of the church would sing a verse, and then like the left side would sing a verse, and then the right side would sing the next verse, and they would go back and forth, which is still used in the Liturgy of the Hours. And then the last bit that Augustine has included the finding of the bodies of the martyrs, Gervasius and Protasius, that as Ambrose is preparing for quite possibly his own martyrdom, they pull up the founding martyrs of Milan, and their bodies are led into the basilica, which is now the Basilica of St. Ambrose. And you can only imagine how powerful this gesture, this event must have been, that as there is an argument over the church and its use, the Bishop Ambrose, who is beloved by the people of Milan, has the founding martyrs of Milan, has their bodies put into the church, and literally makes it clear to everybody that if it comes down to it, he will take his place next to them in martyrdom. So we'll take a quick break. We'll handle any questions right now. And I'm going to put a link up into the chat This is a link to Ambrose's letters on newadvent.org. 20, 21, and 22 are the letters that where Ambrose is talking about these events, the argument with the emperor, with the empress, and the bodies of Gervasius and Protagius. Okay, so we have a question here about the bosom of Abraham and how Augustine would have understood that. So the common understanding now about the bosom of Abraham is that it refers to what is traditionally known as the limbo of the patriarchs. That is the righteous souls who died before the crucifixion. So before the gates of heaven are opened, they have to go somewhere. They don't go to hell because they were righteous, but they can't be saved because Christ has not redeemed mankind. So the traditional reading of that passage came to understand the bosom of Abraham as a reference to this limbo of the patriarchs. And then there's a beautiful iconography that's used in the Eastern churches. That's known as the Anastasius, the resurrection itself, which in the Western church is referred to as the harrowing of hell, where you see that line from the Apostles' Creed that Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried, and descended into hell. That the tradition that emerges from that is that Christ breaks open the gates of hell and he goes there to take all of the patriarchs out. Those who had been sort of in this non-torment section of hell until Christ could save them. The harrowing of hell. I have images on this that I use in my Dante class. When Augustine's writing Confessions in 397, that interpretation is open, but it's not at this point in time a universally accepted interpretation. So it's not as though Augustine is ignorant of church traditions or teachings. It's just that that particular teaching did not have universal approval at this time. It's not that they believed something different, it's just that it wasn't clearly pronounced the way it would be later. Ambrose's part in developing the 4th century creeds, the Nicene Creed. So Ambrose wasn't involved with the Nicene Creed. That's a couple of generations before him. But all of his hymns are basically taking the ideas of the Nicene Creed and putting it into musical form. And here's something where I think to really understand the role that Ambrose has in the church and belief, the Nicene Creed is a statement, that the bishops agree on of what the faith actually is. Just how much the average Christian would understand of the Greek word homoousia, of the same substance, I'm not sure. The theological distinctions being made, the concepts that are being described are very clear cut, that either Jesus is fully God or he's not. The distinctions that you can have in words, I don't know how much that means to the average Christian at the time. The average Christian which isn't to say that they're not believing the right things, it's just theological debates, how much that matters to the average Christian, how much they're capable of understanding the philosophical terms that are being used in those debates. But what Ambrose does is he brilliantly puts the Trinitarian theology in its proper form in lyrics that can be sung, that can be repeated, that can be easily understood. So that's Ambrose's great role with the Nicene Creed, is not so much it's not like he's translating it for the people, but in a sense, he's sort of activating it throughout the day, that it becomes something that's very much a part of what they repeat after they go home from church, if that makes sense. Purgatory at the time of St. Augustine. So the concept of purgatory, that some souls died, they are not in, that their souls are not in a perfect state to be in the vision of God. That belief goes back to the ancient church. Purgatory is not something that was ever invented in terms of the core concept of what purgatory is. At the time of St. Augustine, the words that are used to describe this aren't particularly precise. Augustine himself quite often uses the term refrigium, and he'll talk of purgatorial fires. He tends to, rather than thinking of purgatory rather than using that word to describe a place, he's often describing he's using it as an adjective in terms of what kind of punishment, what kind of refinement is going on. So purgatory has always been taught by the church, and the core substance of the belief has not changed. Tertullian in the 2nd century has comments that, yes, that we pray for the dead. If you find an injunction you won't find an injunction on this in the scriptures anywhere, but this is tradition with the capital T, that the idea of praying for the dead, not for the intercessions of the dead, but praying for the dead, is an apostolic tradition. So purgatory is a church teaching at the time of Augustine, but it's not one of those teachings that is perfectly clarified. Again, the base idea that some people after death are still working on perfecting their souls, that idea was always there. The name purgatory wasn't applied to it immediately. It wasn't always described with the same terminology. And an interesting thing about that, so the best book that I've read on sort of the formation of purgatory, from a secular intellectual historian who's an atheist and has no interest in furthering church doctrine, but he comes to the conclusion, and this is Jacques Le Goff, that the way that purgatory would eventually be described in the Middle Ages, when it did become dogma, was nothing but the logical conclusion of what the church had always taught. So with that, I think it's time to move on now, and we'll go to the second half of Confessions. We note in the first part, lots of Augustine's friends are dying. Verecundus dies, we talk of Nebridius's death, we talk of Adeodatus's death. And so now we're going to talk of Saint Monica. And so we have a pretty good idea where this is headed as well. So after they've been baptized, they decide that the entire group is going to go back to Africa. They travel down to Rome, and then they're going to leave from Ostia, which is the port city of Rome on the Tiber. It's basically just about where Fiumicino Airport is today. I'm passing over many things because time is short, Augustine says. Accept my confessions and thanks for mercies without number, O my God, though I offer them in silence. But I will not pass over anything that my soul brings forth concerning that servant of yours who brought me forth from her flesh to birth in this temporal light, and from her heart to birth in light eternal. So the second half of Confessions here is going to be Augustine giving the tribute that, as an intellectual, as a writer, as a rhetorician, the best tribute that he can give to his mother, and the best tribute that he can give is honesty. He's not going to shrink. He's not going to hide her flaws here. He's going to do for Monica what he has done for himself. which is to present himself exactly as he is to the best of his ability. So in talking about her virtues, her strength as a wife, her strength as a mother, he includes this bit about her fondness for wine. And he's now going to go into one of Monica's shortcomings. That when she was a girl and her parents would send her down to draw wine from the cask underground, she would take a tiny sip by brushing it with her lips before pouring it into the decanter. Repugnance prevented her from taking more, for she was acting not from any real craving from drink, but from a certain exuberance of youthful naughtiness. And we come very close here to the way that he described his own sin with the pear tree. That when he stole those pears, it wasn't because he wanted the pears at all. It was simply that he loved the idea that he was doing something that he knew was evil. And so Saint Monica here is presented as doing something very similar to a much lesser extent than his. But what happens to Monica here? But by adding to that modest allowance, daily modest allowances, for one who allows himself license in little things is ruined little by little. She had fallen at length into the habit of avidly quaffing near goblets full of wine. So what had started as not a love for drink, but just doing something because it was forbidden, slowly, bit by bit, actually turns into a love of drink. And it turns into a sin, it turns into a habit. And how is Monica cured of this? The maid who usually accompanied her to the cask was one day quarreling with her young mistress. So Monica comes from a family that's wealthy enough that they have servants. And the one that's basically assigned to her here naturally is quarreling with her, and flung an accusation against her when the two of them were alone, calling her in the most bitterly insulting language a wine swiller. This shaft went home, and my mother took heed to her disgraceful conduct, condemned it, and threw it off at once. And so here we should remember the story of Alypius that Augustine recounted earlier, where when Augustine knew Alypius as one of his students, Alypius was so virtuous in so many ways, but he loved the circus, and Augustine thought that was absurd. And so Augustine made an example of Alypius in one of his lectures, and it stung Alypius badly. But rather than becoming angry with Augustine, Alypius became angry with himself, because he recognized that what Augustine said was hurtful, but it was hurtful because it was true. And so what happens to Monica here is, she's fighting with her servant. The servant throws something at her, and Monica recognizes that it hurts and it's biting because it's true. And rather than beating the servant, which would be the usual response in Roman society at this point, Monica instead corrects her own life. Just as flattering friends pervert, so quarrelsome foes may often correct us, though you requite them not for what you effect through their means, but for their intention. The angry maid meant to upset her little mistress, not to heal her. So she spoke up in private, either because the quarrel happened to break out in a place and at a time when they were alone, or because she might have exposed herself to danger if it had emerged that she had delayed so long in reporting the matter. But you, Lord, are the ruler of all things in heaven and on earth. And as worldly events flow on their tumultuous way, you dispose them in due order. Through one unwholesome soul, you brought wholesomeness to another, so that no one who takes note of this episode may ascribe it to his own power, if another person who, in his opinion, stands in need of correction, is put right by some word of his. And we've seen this before, where God is able to work through sort of unwitting actors, as it were. That the maid is certainly not trying to help Monica, but through the maid, Monica is healed. And Augustine sees that as, of course, not just through the maid, but God working through the maid. Then in section 19, we have, the beginning of what's probably a kind of disturbing section for most modern readers, a description of what marriage in the classical world is like. First of all, that when she's married and entrusted to a husband, she served him as her Lord, but she made it her business to win him for you by preaching you to him through her way of life. For by her conduct, you made her beautiful in her husband's eyes, as a person to be respected, loved, and admired. And that is extremely unusual in the classical world. The idea that a husband would respect, love, and admire his wife is not normal. That is not the goal of marriage in the ancient world. In the ancient world, marriage is basically something that, in the Roman Empire, it's something that the state takes control of to make sure that there'll be enough future Romans. For families that come from any wealth whatsoever, it's a good way of sort of maintaining that wealth long term. Marrying into another family that won't dissipate all of your wealth, that will help it grow. But the idea that a husband and wife would love each other was absolutely not an expectation that pagan Roman society would have. And so the fact that Monica is able to not only convert her husband, but to bring her husband to a Christian view of marriage that involves respect, love, and admiration for the other. For everything else that we read in this section about what the ancient world and what that marriage looked like, rather than looking down on Patricius for his behaviors, although she gently put up with his marital infidelities, that's something else that was simply accepted as part of marriage in the ancient world. As we talked about the question of the very common use of birth control in the ancient world, one of the easiest ways to make sure as a husband that you don't have more mouths to feed is having affairs with women that you don't have to look over if they end up being pregnant. Having mistresses was probably the most commonly practiced form of birth control because those women could simply be ignored. That is what's normal for the time. What is not normal is that Monica could become beautiful in her husband's eyes, respected, loved, and admired. That in itself is, within this world, almost miraculous. And then we go into the way that Monica deals with her husband, the way that she puts up with his temper, with his infidelities, when she's talking with other women. Women married to husbands of gentler temper whose faces were badly disfigured by traces of blows, who while gossiping together would complain about their husband's behavior. A husband in the ancient world is absolutely allowed to beat his wife. But she checked their talk, reminding them in what seemed to be a joking vein, but with serious import, that from the time they had heard their marriage contracts read out, they had been in duty bound to consider these as legal documents which made slaves of them. Marriage in the Roman world, the wife was the property of the husband. The husband had life and death authority over his family. One of the things that Christianity does not receive credit for is raising up the status of women. In the Roman world, women were legally the property of their fathers and then their husbands. It's Christianity that is able to create an entirely new ideal of marriage, but also the idea that within society that I'm certainly not going to suggest that there was full equality of the sexes in the Middle Ages. but there was the reality that they were no longer viewed simply as property. Augustine in 21 talks about Monica's other virtues, that she was a great peacemaker. And then there's just a fantastic line that we have here where he's talking about her ability to deal with people who are angry. And then you have Augustine talking clearly about himself in 398, 399, when he's a bishop. And he's talking about the people that upset him, and he's trying to have the same ability to deal with them that Monica did. And then we can spend so much time on this, but we do have to get through much tonight. So we'll move into section 23. And this is the last beautiful moment of Augustine and Monica. They're at Ostia, so they're waiting for their ship that's going to take them back to Africa. And they're in a house and they're looking out into the garden. And the scene is just so incredibly rich. The role of the garden in Augustine's own life, the role of the garden in the Bible, the scene of the two of them together. We stood leaning against a window which looked out onto the garden. We were alone, conferring intimately. Forgetting what lay in the past and stretching out to what was ahead, we inquired between ourselves, in the light of present truth, the truth which is yourself, and what the eternal life of the saints would be like. Eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor human heart conceived it. Yet with the mouth of our hearts wide open, we panted thirstily for the celestial stream of your fountain, the fount of life which is with you, that bedewed from it according to our present capacity, we might in our little measure think upon a thing so great. And here we go back to book 7, where Augustine had been reading the books of the Neoplatonists, and he attempts Neoplatonic ecstasy. That is where you meditate upon the things of this world and they lead you beyond the things of this world into the eternal truths. And then ultimately you try to bring your mind into union with the one, that the God of Plotinus, the Neoplatonic God that has its emanations of the one mind and soul. And Augustine tries that in book 7 and he has a glimpse, but he fails. Here he does this with Monica, and they are successful. Our colloquy led us to the point where the pleasures of the body senses, however intense, seemed unworthy not merely of comparison, but even of remembrance beside the joy of that life. And we lifted ourselves in longing, yet more ardent toward that which is, and step by step traversed all bodily creatures and heaven itself, whence sun and moon and stars shed their light upon earth. Higher still we mounted, by inward thought and wondering discourse on your works, and we arrived at the summit of our own minds. And this too we transcended, to touch that land of never failing plenty, where you pasture Israel forever with the food of truth. And as we talked and we panted for it, we just touched the edge of it by the utmost leap of our hearts. Then sighing and unsatisfied, we left the first fruits of our spirit captive there and returned to the noise of articulate speech, where a word has a beginning and end. How different from your word, our Lord, who abides in himself and grows not old, but renews all things. Then we said, if the tumult of the flesh falls silent for someone, and silent too were the phantasms of the air, sea, of the earth, sea, and air, silent the heavens, and the very soul silent to itself, that it might pass beyond itself by not thinking of its own being. If dreams and revelations known through its imagination were silent, if every tongue and every sign and whatever is subject to transients were wholly stilled for him. For if anyone listens, all these things will tell him, we did not make ourselves. He made us, who abides forever and ever. And having said this, they held their peace, for they had pricked the listening ear to him who made them. And then he alone were to speak, not through things that are made, but of himself, that we might hear his word, not through fleshy tongue, nor angel's voice, nor thundercloud, nor any riddling parable. Hear him unmediated, whom we love in all these things. Hear him without them, as we now stretch, and in a flash of thought, touch that eternal wisdom who abides above all things. If this could last, and all other visions so far inferior be taken away, and this sight alone ravish him who saw it, and engulf him, and hide him away, kept for inward joys, so that this moment of knowledge, this passing moment that left us aching for more, should there be life eternal, would not enter into the joy of your Lord, be this and this alone? And when will this be? When will we all rise again, but not all are changed? So did I speak, though not in this wise exactly, nor in these same words. And then Monica gives what are basically her parting words to Augustine. For my part, my son, I find pleasure no longer in anything this life holds. What I am doing here still, or why I tarry, I do not know, for all worldly hope has withered away from me. One thing only there was for which I desired to linger a while in this life, to see you a Catholic Christian before I died. And this my God has granted to me more lavishly than I could have hoped, letting me see you, even spurning earthly happiness, to be his servant. What now keeps me here? And implicit in those words is that she's drawn to the end of everything she was hoping for out of earthly life. And that also includes seeing Augustine move on with the rest of his career. And the love that is implicit, the loving of one as a child of God, not as something, not as my son, not as someone who belongs to me, but loving Augustine as an equal, as another child of God. And there's nothing now, seeing Augustine in that position as a Christian, she's ready to move on. What I replied, I do not clearly remember. And then after this, Monica falls ill and she dies. And Augustine then goes on about his grief. And he's not going to, he went over the deaths of his friends earlier, and he didn't talk much about the grief, just the happiness of knowing where they are. But for Monica, he's going to indulge that grief. He includes the fact that Deodatus bursts out crying, but Augustine himself does not. And this is, the classical world where men do not cry. In response to a ferocious command from my mind, my eyes held the fount in check. And in these final chapters here, you have Augustine dealing with his own grief. And he deals with that grief. He deals with the hurt. He deals with that loss. And we have this beautiful moment where he falls back on what he loved so much about the church at the beginning of his conversion, which were the hymns that were sung in Ambrose's church. And he then cites the hymn here, Creator, God, O Lord of all, Deus Creator Omnia, which Ambrose had written specifically to be a Vespers hymn. So sung at sunset. It becomes the prayer that Augustine is remembering to himself as he lies in bed now. And with these words, now he allows himself to cry. And the tears that I had been holding back, I now released to flow as plentifully as they would, and strewed them as a bed beneath my heart. There it could rest, because there were your ears only. not the ears of anyone who would judge my weeping by the norms of his own pride. Augustine continues writing on, but we're basically at the end of this book now, and then we end with peace. The peace that Monica now lies in, and the peace that he can accept. And with this, we basically have the end of the narrative part of Confessions. So with that, we will stop again. If there's questions, I'll take those. And if you'll excuse me very quickly, I forgot to bring my water down, and an hour of talking has parched my throat. All right. With this beautiful ending to the narrative section, we'll then move into the much more difficult section. For some of you, it might be more meaningful. For some of you, it might make your eyes bleed. The reactions to the two parts of Confessions draw out very different responses from readers. Almost all of the books that you might find talking about Confessions only discuss books 1 through 9. Oh, questions before we move on. Catholic Christian. So this is a huge term that Augustine, I'm sure you noticed all throughout book 9, Catholic Christian. So Catholic here, the first use of Catholic goes back to, I think, Polycarp, but I'm not positive on that. It's 2nd century. Katholikos in Greek just means universal. So for Augustine, in saying Catholic Christian, he's writing this in 397 in North Africa. Even more so than a condemnation of Arianism, it's a condemnation of the Donatists. The Donatists were not even so much a heretical sect as a schismatic sect. There's absolutely heresy in their beliefs. So in the last great persecution under Diocletian, and then actually before that in the mid-3rd century as well, not all of the Catholics who were arrested were executed. Some of them were simply tortured. However, in both of these persecutions, you had some bishops and some priests who handed over their books rather than face persecution. So they were certainly not held up in esteem compared to the martyrs or even the confessors. The confessors is the term for those bishops who refused to hand over the books and faced torture and punishments that fell short of martyrdom. What the Donatists taught is that any of the bishops who had handed over the book, by that action, they were basically no longer bishops. Like most heretical sects, there is an insane emphasis on purity that goes beyond human limits. In the same way that Pelagians taught that, through your willpower alone, you can do all of these wonderful things, that you don't need to rely on grace. The Donatists basically said that the sacraments were only valid if they came from the hand of a priest or a bishop who hadn't betrayed the church. And they also held that any bishop, and this is where it became just a nightmare, any bishop they held who had betrayed the church by handing over the texts, therefore lost the ability to effect the sacraments, including ordination. So any bishop who had been one of these betrayers, any priest that bishop had ordained, according to the Donatists, wasn't actually a priest. And therefore, any marriages, any Eucharist, any confession, any sacrament that priest gave wasn't really a sacrament, because that priest didn't have the authority, because he wasn't really a priest, because he was ordained by a bad bishop. This is what Donatism is. What it turned into, practically speaking, though, is it turned into a North African sect where it was popular, especially amongst the Berber population. That there were in North Africa still some of the native North African ethnic groups, and they had a lower position in society than the pure Romans did. And so the Donatist sect very quickly turned into sort of this schismatic group that was just sort of a local North African church. So they're heretical in their beliefs, but they're also just this individual church, that it's just North Africa. And so Augustine, all throughout this, uses that term Catholic, Christian, Catholic in this universal sense. When he was talking about the scriptures, he insisted on the point that these are the scriptures that you have made known to all people. The universality of the church is something that Augustine talks about nonstop. And it was in large response, in large part due to the Donatist controversy that he was facing in North Africa, where they actually outnumbered Catholics throughout much of his time. They definitely, in the 1390s, they were more popular. And they had this sense of us versus them. We're the authentic North Africans, and the Catholics are the sort of colonialist Romans coming in and imposing on us. So the use of that term Catholic is incredibly important for the context that Augustine is writing this. And it's important in Confessions as well. I mean, it's not just that the church is universal is not just an issue for Augustine in North Africa, it's an issue for the church as a whole. But that's sort of the background to all of this. I had to skip over this. Just trying to figure out what to talk about here. Monica changes basically the funeral plans that she had. Originally, so she had a burial plot next to Patricius, Augustine's father. Augustine's father had died back in book 3. I think it's book 3. His father's death is mentioned in passing it's when Augustine is talking about reading Cicero and Hortensius. He mentions that his mother was now paying for his education because his father had died when he was 17. Monica had a plot that was next to Patricius, and the idea is that she wanted to be buried next to him. When they get to Ostia, she says that that's not important. And it's the letting go of the last earthly tie, that the site of the burial doesn't matter. And we'll have to go find that line just because it's beautiful, where somebody is asking her about why is, here we are. talking about why she's okay being buried in Ostia. They were amazed at such courage in a woman, for it was you who had given it to her, and asked whether she was not afraid to leave her body so far from her own city. Nothing is far from God, she replied. There is no danger that at the end of the world he will not know where to find me and raise me up. So even the consolation that you have of having your remains lying next to the beloved, she's transcended even that at the end, that she loves God with her whole heart, mind, and soul, and everything else is completely secondary to that. Okay, so book 10. We'll do what we can. This book is, so the first half of book 10 goes up to chapter 38. So you've seen it in your own editions, just how long this is. What I will try to do here, I certainly can't go through it the way that I've gone through others, more or less the entire text, just pointing things out. There's no time for that here, and I'm pretty sure most of you would tune out about 10 minutes into this. What is Augustine doing? So he's explaining exactly what this confession is. And what he wants to do here, and this line here is so key, 10:2. To you then, Lord, I lie exposed exactly as I am. I've spoken of what I hope to gain by confessing to you. So exactly as I am, Augustine has done his best to present himself as he knows himself best to God. So the question is, how does he know God? And it comes down to the question of memory. What is the role of memory in this? And I'm pretty sure your books have a footnote that Augustine's use of that word is broader than our sense of the word memory. At one point in time, he has memory almost, no, he actually does say that it's almost the same thing as mind itself. So it's the question of where exactly do we know, where do we encounter God? And for Augustine, when falling short of an ecstatic vision, when you go beyond your mind, as he and Monica did very briefly, the ordinary way of encountering God is in memory. So he wants to know what exactly is that, so that he can understand how he's getting to know God. And then, of course, all throughout this, we have sprinkled these little notices of Augustine being very deeply concerned that people are going to misinterpret him or apply bad motives to him. And he's doing the absolute best that he can to insist that everything that he's doing is sincere. So yet charity believes without stint, at least among those who are bonded together by charity, section 3. And so I also confess to you, Lord, in such a way that people to whom I can offer no proof may discern whether I confess truthfully. I cannot prove it, but all whose ears are open to me by love will believe me. So then what is he doing here as he's going through the fullness of his confession is approaching this issue of how exactly do we come to know God? How does that occur? In section 8, we start off with, and this had been sort of the process of the Neoplatonists as well, that you look at creation around you, you look at the things that you can sense. But you don't stop there. You use the beauty of the created world, and you combine that with the knowledge that whatever created the beautiful world must be much more beautiful still. What am I loving when I love you? Not beauty of body, nor transient grace, not this fair light, which is now so friendly to my eyes, not melodious song and all its lovely harmonies, and Augustine so loves song. Not the sweet fragrance of flowers or ointments or spices, not manna or honey, not limbs that draw me to carnal embrace. And so he goes through all of the senses. And we'll notice throughout book 10 that the senses appear again and again. None of these do I love when I love God. And yet I do love a kind of light, a kind of voice, a certain fragrance, a food and an embrace when I love my God. A light, voice, fragrance, food, and embrace for my inmost self, where something limited to no place shines into my mind, where something not snatched away by passing time sings for me, where something no breath blows away yields to me its scent, where there is savor undiminished by famished eating, and where I am clasped in a union from which no satiety can tear me away. This is what I love when I love my God. And what is this? I put the question to the earth, and it replied, I am not he. I questioned everything it held. They confessed the same. I questioned the sea and the great deep and the teeming live creatures that crawl, and they replied, we are not God, seek higher. I questioned the gusty winds, and every breeze with all its flying creatures told me, Anaximenes was wrong. I am not God. To the sky I put the question, to sun, moon, stars, but they denied me. We are not the God you seek. And to all things which stood around the portals of my flesh, I said, tell me of my God. You are not he, but tell me something of him. Then they lifted up their mighty voices and cried, he made us. My questioning was my attentive spirit, and their reply, their beauty. So we look at the created world around us, we appreciate it for everything that it is, and we recognize that they still point us to something that he had described previous, this desperate yearning and feeling that goes beyond what we can experience with our senses, that's similar to them, but goes beyond that. And all of nature points to something further. And so then the question is, where do we go from there? And we don't go further out, we turn in. My inmost self. And within the inmost self, I who was that inmost self, I who was mind, knew them through the senses of my body. And so I questioned the vast frame of the world concerning my God, and it answered, I am not he, but he made me. So even that most innermost faculty of your mind recognizes that it is not self-sufficient. And then we go on to the question of memory that I think we're just going to skip over, basically. It goes on from 12 to 20, beyond 25, mind, the very self, the question of memory, forgetting, and then finally to 29. Augustine's psychology is fascinating. It's clearly very well thought out. He's put a ton of time into this. However, we could do an entire class just on his psychology. I don't know how many people would sign up for that, though. The question that we come down to, the universal desire for happiness. This is one of the proofs that Augustine doesn't need proofs of God to believe that God exists, but he's going to look for universal traits amongst people that point in a direction that we all can follow. And what he's going through here is that it doesn't really matter what it is that people are going after, whatever it is that people are doing, they are pursuing all of these things. And this has sort of been in the background so much of Confessions. They're pursuing all of these things out of the idea that in this pursuit, they will come to happiness, to a sort of fulfillment. The Greek term eudaimonia, or the Latin summum bonum, the summum bonum, the highest good, that which once you have it makes you completely happy, and you no longer lack anything and you don't want anything else. Essentially what Augustine is recognizing is that we all experience that. We all have a desire towards this desire to be happy. The way that we pursue it differs very much. The accidents of life differ, as it is. going through all of this, he comes then 31. So where and when did I experience my life of happiness so as to remember, love, and desire it? So happiness has to be something that involves memory. But in what way? This desire is not confined to me alone, nor to me and a few others. Absolutely all of us want to be happy. Unless we had some sure knowledge of it, our wills would not be so firmly set on gaining it. And what he's pulling on here, and he's going beyond it, is the Platonic idea of memory, that Plato held that basically the mind already knew everything, because he believed in transmigration of souls. And so the process of learning for Plato is simply having the mind remember what it already learned once. The Neoplatonists had this, and they took it in a different direction. I believe Plotinus's formation of it is that this remembrance occurs because of the role of mind and soul in creating the individual mind, which then seeks union with the ultimate mind. But the fact that everybody has this desire for happiness, this sense of longing for something that invokes the memory, that's what Augustine's pulling on here. And this is this search that he's been on throughout his life, that everybody pursues, and it's planted there ultimately by God. And I think with that very quick passing over of just the idea of what Augustine's trying to do, then we'll come to the end of what I've marked out as this first section, with one of the best known sections out of the book. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new, section 38. Late have I loved you. Lo, you were within, but I outside, seeking there for you. And upon the shapely things you have made, I rushed headlong. I, misshapen. You were with me, but I was not with you. They held me back far from you, those things which would have no being were they not in you. You called, shouted, broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance, I gasped, and now I pant for you. I tasted you, and I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. So after this long meditation on just the nature of memory, what memory is, how memory is our experience of God, outside of those bursts of ecstatic contact with the divine. We come back to just this beautiful Latin poem that he's written, Sero te amavi, late have I loved you. And we'll note that it ends here with that recitation of the senses that he's been going through. Although here in the reverse order that we have hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch. And in other places, in the next section, we'll see it beginning with touch. But we'll notice that in all of these, it's God reaching out to Augustine. It's that question of grace that for Augustine is the foundational reality of the relationship between God and man. Okay, and so we'll pause there for any more questions before we go on to the second half of book 10. Which again, we'll go through quickly simply because going through it slowly would make it more confusing. This is one of those sections, and my advice to you, especially so next week, we're going to look at books 11 through 13. They're all very long books, and we're doing them all at once because the first time that you read these parts of Augustine, it's actually somewhat easy, and this would be my recommendation if you're struggling, just to read through it quickly. when something's confusing, note that it's confusing, but just move on. If you allow yourself to get bogged down with what's confusing, you'll never get through those 3 books. And Confessions 10 is like that as well. The first few times that you read it, and still sometimes when I read it, Augustine can be repetitive, and he can go on arguments that are incredibly long-winded. Just blow through them rather than feeling as though you have to understand every single thought. My suggestion, anyway. And we will notice one of the other lines that I highlighted here, because this also is going to come up in one of the last sections of book 10. Your best servant is the one who is less intent on hearing from you what accords with his own will, and more on embracing with his will what he has heard from you. One of the universal flaws of human nature is our tendency to ignore things that don't agree with what we want to believe about the world, but to have the genuine relationship with God, we have to be willing to conform our will to God's will. Okay, so the last half of book 10, and this is only slightly joking, readers' patience tested. That's just book 10. Give what you command. Augustine, another famous formulation that comes out of this book, and a reflection upon grace. Then the question of the senses and the 3 major temptations: the concupiscence of the flesh, the concupiscence of the eyes, and pride. Question: how long will we have access to your recorded session after this class ends? I'm not really sure. What's probably going to happen is I'm going to forget about them entirely. I'm not planning on turning off access anytime soon. So if you would like to go back over this later, you're certainly welcome to. If I do end up taking them down, and at some point in time I will, if you would like, I can probably transfer them on to thumb drives or something. And, although I've had no problems with YouTube because, it's such a small traffic number, who knows what the future of sites like YouTube hold when it comes to, things like religious-based classes. Oh, yeah. So in chat, having read Aquinas's Philosophy of Man and St. John of the Cross, The Ascent, I'm struck with some of his argument on the faculties and the things they have in common. So Aquinas, and I'm assuming here that by faculties you're referring to faculty psychology, which is the understanding that they have of how the mind works. Augustine, there's 2 major sources that Aquinas has when he's considering psychology. And that is St. Augustine and Aristotle. Aristotle wasn't very important for Augustine. We tend to think of Aristotle as, one of the 2 great classical philosophers. But in late antiquity, Aristotle had a much lower level of appreciation. Basically, he was read mostly for his logical works, including the categories, which is what Augustine had read of Aristotle. Plato was by far the more important, or the more well-read, the more commonly read. And then with Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, people liked Plato, but they didn't really read him anymore. They read Porphyry and Plotinus. It's not until you get to, about the 11th or 12th century that Aristotle is rediscovered. And in the 12th century, Aristotle is basically, the entire corpus is translated into Latin. First from Arabic translations of the Greek, and then from Greek directly itself. And Aristotle is he's just fantastic for having a complete system of what we'll call natural philosophy. Before you have science, sort of experimental methodological naturalism, you have natural philosophy, which is the study of scientific subjects in a non-mathematical way. And Aristotle does that better than anybody. So all of that comes into the West in the 12th century, and then the 13th century is really synthesizing all of this. So Aquinas's philosophy of man is basically bringing together Aristotle's De Anima, Aristotle's work on the soul, taking that framework and combining some of that with Augustine. Although the way that Augustine discusses memory is very similar to what Aristotle has to say in most places. There's some major key differences, however. But a lot of the, and we'll keep in mind that the word psychology in the Greek means the study of the soul. The psyche is the Greek term for the soul in the larger sense of everything that makes a living thing a living thing. So that also includes the mind and intellect. It's all part of the fantastic Western intellectual tradition. And I'm glad that the similarities between Augustine, Aquinas, and John of the Cross occurred to you as you're reading this. With that, we'll go on and we'll do then the final section of book 10. So 39, opening up this second part. When at last I cling to you with my whole being, there will be no more anguish or labor for me, and my life will be alive indeed because filled with you. But now it is very different. Anyone whom you fill, you also uplift, but I am not full of you, so I am a burden to myself. Joys over which I ought to weep do battle with sorrows that should matter for joy, and I know not which will be victorious. But I also see griefs that are evil at war in me with joys that are good, and I know not which will win the day. This is agony, Lord, have pity on me. It is agony. See, I do not hide my wounds. You are the physician, and I am sick. You are merciful, I in need of mercy. Is not human life on earth a time of testing? So I divided it up at this point because the first part of the book is about memory as the place where we encounter God. And in the second part, we're getting into that actual encounter and God's active role within our lives here. Continuing on, who would choose troubles and hardships? You command us to endure them, but not to love them. No one loves what he has to endure, even if he loves the endurance. For although he may rejoice in his power to endure, he would prefer to have nothing that demands endurance. God does not ask us to be masochists. It's one thing to bear your cross. It's another to convince yourself that you have to love that. You don't love the cross, you love the ability to endure it for the love of God. In adverse circumstances, I long for prosperity, and in times of prosperity, I dread adversity. What middle ground is there between the two where human life might be free from trial? Woe and woe again betide worldly prosperity, from fear of disaster and evanescent joy. But woe, woe, and woe again upon worldly adversity, from envy of better fortune, the hardship of adversity itself, and the fear that endurance may falter. Is not human life on earth a time of testing without respite? And so we have this formulation of life on earth, with its troubles and hardships that you endure because you're commanded to endure, not because you're supposed to love suffering for its own sake. You suffer for the sake of another. But the solution to all of this, on your exceedingly great mercy rests all my hope. Give what you command, and then command whatever you will. So another famous formulation out of the Confessions, da quid ubis quod vis. What Augustine is saying is that unlike what he'll be arguing, in 12 years with the Pelagians, is that it's not up to the human will to steel itself for all of these trials. It's up to the human being to depend on God. So what Augustine is saying here is that God commands us to do certain things, but God's grace gives us the ability to do those things. Give what you command, give the ability to follow through with what is commanded, and then command whatever you will. You order us to practice continence. A certain writer tells us, I knew that no one can be continent except by God's gift, and that it is already a mark of wisdom to recognize whose gift this is. By continence, the scattered elements of the self are collected and brought back into the unity from which we have slid away into dispersion. So all that we saw before his conversion, the divided self, fragmentation, all of that he's bringing here by continence. The scattered elements of the self are collected and brought back into the unity that God created. The division, the scattered elements, was created by man's decision to sin. For anyone who loves something else along with you, but does not love it for your sake, loves you less. O love ever burning, never extinguished. O charity, my God, set me on fire. You command continence, give what you command, and then command whatever you will. And this is Augustine's experience. He spends 12 years trying to command himself to be continent, and he fails utterly. The experience in the garden where he's finally willing to accept God's grace, to accept God's love, as he's having that discussion in his own mind, the figure of continence, personification, allegory, appears to him, and he sees her as beautiful, and he embraces continence here. Continence that is the gift of God, not some victory that he's won simply through his own willpower. So then we go to the commands, to refrain from concupiscence of the flesh, concupiscence of the eyes, and worldly pride. And so he'll go through these one by one, and concupiscence of the flesh first. And of course, he's going to start with the sense of touch. And in his memory, and Augustine's writing this, 10, 12 years after he's been converted. But again, he's exceedingly honest. Yet in my memory, of which I've spoken at length, sexual images survive because they were imprinted there by former habit. While I am awake, they suggest themselves feebly enough, but in dreams with power to arouse me not only to pleasurable sensations, but even to consent, to something closely akin to the act they represent. He goes through this, he's a priest in 391, I believe. He's been made a bishop just a few years before this, but he still struggles with this. This is the force of habit, that even though he's conquered the habit, in his memory, this still lurks. And in all of this, he depends on God. Is your hand not powerful enough to heal all my soul's ills? 42. All powerful God, and by still more generous grace to extinguish unruly stirrings, even in my sleep. And then he's going to go through all of the senses that have been a part of book 10 one by one, and taste. And he notices his tendency towards gluttony here, not to drunkenness, that he's never had a problem with that. But he notices something about taste, that he can avoid lust by simply banishing lust entirely from his life. And that's what he does. He embraces continence. However, gluttony is different. You can't simply decide never to eat again. And so he's stuck at every meal with wondering of, when I pass from uncomfortable need, from real hunger, to tranquil satisfaction, to eating out of pleasure. The snare of concupiscence lies waiting for me in the very passage from one to the other. For this transition itself is pleasurable, yet there is no other route for us to take if we are to arrive where necessity forces us to go. Preservation of our health is justification for eating and drinking, but perilous partiality comes hot on its heels, and indeed often tries to run ahead, and so becomes the real motive for what I profess to do, and I hope I am doing, in the interest of health. And we'll notice, and how does he combat this? By fasting. By fasting, I wage a daily warfare and habitually force my body to obey me. And again, there's so much to go through. I can't stop on this the way that I did previously before. But you can read over this and see, as he goes through all of these examples that he has, the temptation of taste and what taste can lead into. Smell, he goes through that very quickly. I'm not much troubled by sensuality, but hearing. And we've seen how much Augustine loves song, provided the words are sung sensitively by a tuneful voice. So it needs to be good music. The melodies, however, demand a place of some dignity in my heart. And this is where Augustine is kind of torn. Is he recognizes how important sacred music was for his own conversion. That it's the sacred music that he heard in the Basilica, when he heard the congregation singing Ambrose's songs. He was so moved by that experience. As he's trying to grieve Monica's death, it's remembering Ambrose's song and singing that song to himself in bed that allows him to fully grieve her loss. And he recognizes, he's very clear about the beauty of music. I am aware that our minds are more deeply moved to devotion by those holy words when they are sung, and more ardently inflamed to piety than would be the case without singing. That the song counts as double for prayer. For this reason, the emotional involvement that occurs through the beautiful sounds here. Yet sensuous gratification, to which I must not yield my mind for fear it grow languid, often deceives me. So Augustine is trying to find that balance between beautiful sacred music that leads you to God and beautiful music that can distract you into just appreciating the beauty of music. But of course, as I said before, he remembers the tears shed at the church's song in the early days of his newly recovered faith. So I just love the way that he sort of comes up with this dividing line for where music should fall. When the singing has a more powerful effect on me than the sense of what is sung, I confess my sin and my need of repentance, and then I would rather not hear any singer. And this brings us back to Ambrose, and what Ambrose was doing with those beautiful hymns is he's teaching Trinitarian theology. If you find yourself loving the tune and ignoring the words and ignoring the content of those words just for the sound, that's when it goes into concupiscence rather than spiritual enlightenment. And sight is pretty clear, just the beauty visual beauty that obviously works on Augustine. And then he'll speak of that, for a bit. We want to move on, though, to the concupiscence of the eyes and the distinction made between the concupiscence of the eyes and the concupiscence of the flesh, because he includes a love of visual beauty, not as concupiscence of the eyes, but as the visual form of concupiscence of the flesh. The distinction that he's making here is what he'll call, it's just curiosity. Concupiscence of the mind is basically what he means by concupiscence of the eyes here. A frivolous, avid curiosity that masquerades as a zeal for knowledge and learning. And he notes a distinction here between curiosity and concupiscence of the flesh. That the question of concupiscence of the flesh is that it all involves beauty, beautiful sights, beautiful sounds, beautiful sensations. But the concupiscence of the eyes, that curiosity, oddly enough, works on oddities and even ugliness. Things that are fascinating in their oddity in a way that is not beauty at all. And then having to move on through this, pride. And Augustine fully recognizes how dangerous pride is to him, because before his conversion, his entire life is based on pride. All of book 1, all of book 2 and 3, most of the first 6 books, really. Augustine is a brilliant young man. He gets top honors, he wins awards, he's the best student, he's one of the best teachers, and all of his life, that classical world is built on honor. The best thing to strive for in classical pagan Roman society is honor that is won through recognition of excellence leading to fame. So that world that he grows up in, that his parents push him in for his own worldly success. Now, after his conversion, he recognizes all of that as pride. This is the temptation, section 59, to want veneration and affection from others, and to want them not for the sake of some quality that merits them, but in order to make such admiration itself the cause of my joy. So it's not a question of you have to despise your excellence or pretend that what you have isn't really excellent. That in itself is a different sin. Pretending that what you know is excellent really isn't, because you're pretending to have humility. That's not what Augustine's looking at here. What he's making a distinction between is you can acknowledge veneration and affection from others based on something that really merits that. But if you're only looking for the admiration itself, if you're trying to do wonderful things simply to be admired rather than appreciating admiration for what it is that you've done, then it's pride, because it's just to make admiration itself the cause of joy. And this line, and the enemy of our true happiness therefore lies in wait for those of us who, by reason of our official positions in human society, must of necessity be loved and honored by our fellows. So Augustine, being a bishop, in a certain sense, it's wonderful for the church because he's brilliant. He's everything that a bishop should be. But for him personally, there's something terrible in that, because he becomes the leading figure. And being the leading figure, he becomes a figure that is the object of love and affection from the entire diocese, which is exactly playing into the trap of his own pride that he recognizes in himself. And so for Augustine, who is so concerned about his true motivations for doing things and what other people perceive as his motivations for doing things, the role of bishop is, it's almost a torture if that's the particular fault that you have, wanting to make sure that you're always doing things for the right reason, rather than just to be loved by the crowd, or believing or wanting to make sure that people believe you are doing things for the right reason, when criticism is inescapable, especially if you are, as Augustine is, bishop in an area where you have competing beliefs. You have the Donatists in North Africa, you still have Arians, and the Arians will be coming to North Africa toward the end of Augustine's life. And they're throwing horrible abuses at each other. And Augustine is so concerned that his own flock believed in his sincerity for his actions. And Augustine, he recognizes his own faults. And in this one, what do people think of him? Do they love him? Is this something, this is something, in other areas of temptation, I have some shrewdness in self-examination, but in this matter, almost none. When he's talking sensual desires or idle curiosity are concerned, I can measure my progress in self-restraint by going without these pleasures, either voluntarily or because opportunity for indulgence is lacking. In that situation, I question myself as to whether I am more troubled by their absence or less. So with worldly things, that doesn't really matter. But what of praise? Praise for Augustine is such a danger. If a good life characterized by noble works inevitably and rightly entails being commended, neither the good life nor the resultant commendation can be renounced. Yet only when something pleasant has been withdrawn can I be sure of my ability to live without it, either contentedly or perhaps without reluctance. So that issue of being commended, it goes back to his childhood, and he recognized the dangers in seeking only condemnation. But now living as a bishop, being commended is something that needs to be the result of doing what is right for the church and being a successor to the apostles, and not in simply acting in such a way so as to get to that commendation. And it's something that Augustine, he's never going to be able to get over that fear of what he's doing. And then we come back to the pride, and I'm reluctant then to have a person who speaks highly of me holding a different opinion from my own on the subject of myself. But how am I to know whether this reaction springs from concern for the other person's welfare? And he comes to this fantastic observation that not only does he want commendation from others, but he wants to be commended on the things that he himself prides about himself. I'm saddened at times by the adulation I receive when qualities of mine which I do not myself much like are eulogized, or even when good points which are of only slight importance to me are rated more highly than they deserve. And somebody wrote to me that as they were reading this, they had the thought of, they kind of just wish Augustine would get over himself temporarily. And we can definitely get to that point. But the observations that he has, when they don't seem like repetitiveness to us, they're incredibly incisive. That line that he has there, I just absolutely love. That, it's not enough that he be commended. He wants to be commended for precisely the things that he himself wants to be commended on. And that in itself is pride there. Going through all of this, however, as he goes through all of these temptations, we come back to Christ, the mediator, priest, and victim. Whom could I find to reconcile me to you? That only Jesus Christ, as fully man and fully God, is capable of being that mediator that Augustine so sorely needs, that we all so sorely need. Once we come to that acknowledgement of the role of grace. How you loved us, section 69, O good Father, who spared not even your only Son, but gave him up for us evildoers. How you loved us, for whose sake he who deemed it no robbery to be your equal, was made subservient even to the point of dying on a cross. Alone of all, he was free among the dead, for he had the power to lay down his life and power to retrieve it. For our sake, he stood to you as both victor and victim, and victor because victim. For us, he stood to you as priest and sacrifice, and priest because sacrifice, making us sons and daughters to you instead of servants, by being born of you to serve us. With good reason is there solid hope for me in him, because you will heal all my infirmities, through him who sits at your right hand and intercedes for us. Were it not so, I would despair. Many and grave are those infirmities, many and grave, but wider reaching is your healing power. We might have despaired, thinking your word remote from any conjunction with humankind, had he not become flesh and made his dwelling among us. Filled with terror by my sins and my load of misery, I had been turning over in my mind a plan to flee into solitude, but you forbade me and strengthened me by your words. To this end Christ died for all, you reminded me, that they who are alive may not live for themselves, but for him who died for them. See then, Lord, I cast my care upon you that I may live, and I will contemplate the wonders you have revealed me. You know how stupid and weak I am. Teach me and heal me. Your only Son, in whom are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge, has redeemed me with his blood. Let not the proud disparage me, for I am mindful of my ransom. I eat it, I drink it, I dispense it to others, and as a poor man, I long to be filled with it among those who are fed and feasted. And then do those who seek him praise the Lord. So, after all of these pages of, we might consider intellectual self-indulgence, we come back to Christ. And though Augustine would very happily go off and be an ascetic, he's called to something different. And he's called to this position that puts him in constant concern of others and himself and his relation to them. But he does all of this for Christ. And on that, we're done with book 10. We're done with this lecture. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those. For next week, it's long reading. There's no way around that. Feel free to skim it for a first reading. Feel free to read it in whatever way actually works. If that means stopping at parts of book 11 and just moving on to 12 or 13, do that. There is the second essay that is at the back of the book. It's called Creation in the Confessions. And that's page 475, Creation in the Confessions. That's what we're headed towards in 11, 12, and 13, is our understanding of our relationship with God, and above all, what we see the Creator creating in Genesis 1 and 2. Thank you very much. I'll look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll see how the experience with these 3 books has gone. Have a good week.